It was just another Saturday night at GameStop. As the narrator parked in the dimly lit lot, a sense of unease settled in. The fluorescent sign flickered against the darkening sky, casting eerie shadows that danced across the pavement. Inside, the familiar hum of fluorescent lights greeted them, illuminating shelves stocked with games and collectibles. Felix, the friendly manager, welcomed them with a smile, while Bryce vacuumed nearby, the mechanical whirring filling the quiet. The air felt heavy, almost electric, as they prepared for closing time, exchanging stories and laughter to ease the tension. But as the clock neared 9:30 p.m., an unsettling stillness enveloped the store. Just then, the phone rang, piercing the silence. Felix glanced at the caller ID, his expression shifting from casual to concerned. The narrator's heart raced as they leaned in, sensing that something was wrong. Outside, the wind howled softly, a whisper of the impending storm. Little did they know, this night would plunge them into a nightmare, transforming their beloved store into a chilling stage for fear and uncertainty. Inside GameStop, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The bright fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting unsettling shadows across the aisles filled with games, consoles, and collectibles. The narrator, alongside Bryce and Felix, busied themselves with the routine tasks of restocking and cleaning, but the air felt charged, as if something unseen was watching them. Felix moved methodically behind the counter, counting the register's cash while keeping an eye on the store. Bryce vacuumed the carpet, but even the comforting sound of the machine felt muted, swallowed by the growing stillness around them. Laughter and chatter were replaced by a heavy silence, creating an unsettling contrast to the usual buzz of customer activity. As the clock approached closing time, an uncanny sense of isolation settled in. They glanced at each other, a flicker of unease reflected in their expressions. The night outside grew darker, the wind rustling through the trees, sending a shiver down the narrator's spine. It was in that moment that they realized, despite the familiar surroundings, this night held a different energy, a foreboding that loomed just out of sight, waiting to reveal itself. As the clock ticked closer to 9:30 p.m., the stillness of the store was abruptly shattered by the shrill ring of the phone. The sound cut through the heavy silence, echoing ominously in the almost empty GameStop. Felix, standing behind the counter, looked up, momentarily startled. He glanced at the caller ID, uncertainty etched across his face. The narrator and Bryce paused in their tasks, eyes widening with curiosity and concern. Normally, they wouldn't answer calls this late, but the ringing persisted, insistent and demanding attention. Felix reluctantly lifted the receiver to his ear, his usual cheerful greeting quickly replaced by a tense demeanor. The narrator watched as Felix's expression shifted from casual to serious, a look of concern creeping in. The conversation seemed to drag on, the silence growing heavier with each passing second. The narrator's heart raced, an instinctual feeling that something was wrong creeping in. Felix's voice dropped to a near whisper as he relayed what he was hearing. The atmosphere thickened with dread, the once familiar surroundings now tinged with an unsettling sense of foreboding. This was no ordinary call, something dark was unfolding, and they were about to find out what. Felix hung up the phone, his face pale and tense. The room felt suffocating as he turned to the narrator and Bryce, who were both hanging on his every word. "There's someone calling every GameStop in the area," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They are threatening to rob one, and they've targeted us." A chill ran down the narrator's spine, and they exchanged worried glances with Bryce. Was this some twisted prank, or was it something far more sinister? Felix's demeanor suggested the latter. He instructed them to lock the back door, urgency replacing any semblance of normalcy that remained. As they hurried to secure the entrance, the phone rang again, echoing ominously in the silence. Felix answered, his expression morphing into confusion. "Hello," he said, but only silence greeted him. A cold sweat trickled down the narrator's back as the line went dead. The phone rang again almost instantly, a cruel reminder of their growing dread. When Felix answered once more, heavy breathing filled the line, an unmistakable sound that sent waves of fear coursing through the trio. This wasn't just a threat anymore, it was a chilling reality, closing in on them like a predator stalking its prey. With the weight of Felix's words hanging heavily in the air, the atmosphere inside GameStop transformed from mundane to menacing. The trio hurried into the back room, their hearts racing as they fumbled with the heavy metal alarm door. The metallic clank echoed ominously, a stark reminder of their vulnerable situation. Felix's voice was firm as he directed Bryce and the narrator to ensure every entrance was secured. "We need to lock this place down," he said, urgency lacing his tone. The narrator could feel their palms growing clammy as they glanced around, the dim lighting casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward them, as if the darkness itself were alive. As Bryce twisted the lock, the phone rang again, jolting them into silence. The narrator's heart raced. Was it the same caller? Felix answered, but the only sound on the line was a chilling silence. It was as if the world outside had held its breath, waiting. Bryce, his nerves frayed, grabbed the phone and repeatedly pressed the END button, desperation flooding his actions. Every unanswered call amplified their sense of dread, and as the store fell into a tense quiet, they realized they were no longer just employees, they were prisoners in their own sanctuary, with an unseen threat lurking just outside. The silence in the back room was deafening, punctuated only by the distant ringing of the phone and the muffled sounds of the outside world. Felix stood tense at the counter, his eyes darting nervously between the receiver and the back door. The air felt thick with anxiety, and the narrator could hear their own heartbeat pounding in their ears. Then it came, a phone call, the screen lighting up with a familiar number. Felix answered, his voice wavering slightly as he greeted the caller, "Hello." But there was no response, only a chilling silence on the other end. It stretched on, unnerving and oppressive, like a heavy fog closing in around them. When Felix hung up, the phone rang again almost immediately. This time, the atmosphere shifted, the tension became palpable. He answered once more, but instead of words, the line filled with slow, heavy breathing, deep and deliberate, each breath sounding like a ghostly echo. The narrator's stomach dropped as Bryce's face turned pale. The fear was suffocating, wrapping around them like a vice. It felt like a warning, an indication that they were not alone. This was no longer just a phone call, it was a threat, a sinister presence inching closer, ready to pounce. The atmosphere in the back room was electric with fear. Bryce and the narrator stood frozen, their breaths shallow as the phone continued to ring ominously in the distance. Every echoing chime felt like a countdown, a reminder that danger lurked just outside their fragile sanctuary. The walls seemed to close in, and shadows danced menacingly in the dim light. "Should we go check?" Bryce whispered, his voice trembling with uncertainty. The narrator felt a surge of dread, leaving the relative safety of the backroom felt like stepping into a nightmare. Instead, they listened intently as the phone rang again, each sound sending chills down their spines. "Maybe we should just stay here," the narrator suggested, desperation seeping into their words. The fear was palpable, a living entity in the cramped space. They exchanged glances, a shared understanding of the terror that gripped them. Suddenly, a loud knock reverberated through the back door, startling them. The sound echoed like thunder in the stillness, and the narrator's heart raced. It was a reminder that they weren't just hiding from a voice on the phone, they were trapped in a dark game with an unseen predator closing in on them, waiting for the right moment to strike. The atmosphere in the backroom felt charged with panic as the knock echoed ominously, sending shockwaves of terror through the trio. Felix's face drained of color, and he quickly motioned for silence. They huddled together, hearts pounding, straining to hear over the deafening silence that followed. The knock had shattered their fragile sense of safety, and the shadows seemed to creep closer, thickening around them like a suffocating fog. "What if it's him?" Bryce whispered, eyes wide with fear. The narrator nodded, feeling a knot tighten in their stomach. They were no longer just dealing with a phone call, this was a real threat, a manifestation of their worst nightmares. The phone rang again, piercing through the thick tension. Felix reluctantly picked it up, his hands shaking. "Hello," he managed, but again, there was only that chilling, labored breathing on the other end. Suddenly, another knock reverberated through the metal door, louder this time, followed by a voice, a distorted, mocking laughter that sent chills down their spines. "Let me in," it taunted, dripping with menace. The narrator's heart raced, realizing they were no longer just waiting, they were being hunted, and the hunter was closing in. As the distorted laughter echoed through the store, the fear that enveloped the trio morphed into sheer panic. Felix's face hardened with determination, his grip on the phone tightening as he whispered, "We need to call the police." But the narrator could see the hesitation in his eyes, time was slipping away, and they were running out of it. "Do we stay here?" Bryce's voice shook as he glanced at the back door, the echo of that mocking laughter reverberating in his mind. "What if he tries to get in?" The narrator felt an urge to take action, a flicker of defiance amidst the growing dread. "We can't just hide. We need to find a way to secure the front." They exchanged glances, understanding the unspoken bond of survival that had formed among them. Just then, the phone rang again, cutting through the thick tension. Felix answered, his expression shifting to one of shock. "What do you mean he used his real number?" he stammered, disbelief evident in his voice. Outside, the night deepened, and with it came a sense of foreboding that they could no longer ignore. Their sanctuary was breached, and the predator was close, waiting to strike. As Felix hung up the phone, the weight of his words settled heavily in the air. "The police got involved," he said, his voice steadied by the relief of knowing help was on the way. "They've got the guy." He didn't even think to hide his number. The trio exchanged glances, a mix of confusion and relief flooding over them. They had been paralyzed by fear, caught in a web of uncertainty, but now there was a glimmer of hope. The nightmare they had been living through was finally coming to an end. Just then, the distant sound of sirens pierced the night, growing louder as they approached the store. The narrator felt a wave of emotions wash over them: relief, exhaustion, and the lingering fear of what had just transpired. The chilling laughter and heavy breathing that had haunted them now felt like a fading echo, replaced by the reassuring presence of law enforcement. As the police arrived, their uniforms gleaming in the store's harsh lights, the reality of the situation began to sink in. They were safe, but the experience had left its mark, a haunting reminder that even in the most familiar places, danger could lurk just beneath the surface.